On the sunny morning of August 23, 1958, Arthur Pemberton, a 63-year-old retiree with too much free time and an insatiable curiosity about his neighbors' lives, was watering his purple petunias on the porch of his home in Bethesda, Maryland. The green metal watering can dripped water onto the sun-warmed concrete, while his eyes, protected by tortoise-shell reading glasses, discreetly observed number 247 across the street. There was something wrong with the Hoffmans. Arthur couldn't identify exactly what, but 40 years working as an auditor for the Treasury Department had sharpened his instinct for inconsistencies, and the Hoffmans were a walking collection of inconsistencies. Peter Hoffman claimed to be a civil engineer, but never had dirt under his nails. His wife, Greta, supposedly a German immigrant, pronounced certain words with an accent that didn't sound German at all. And then there was the trash. Oh yes, the trash. Arthur Pemberton didn't know that his harmless obsession as a bored retiree, cataloging schedules, observing patterns, and occasionally peeking into neighbors' trash cans, was about to unmask one of the most sophisticated Soviet espionage operations infiltrated into American government institutions. All because he noticed that nobody who claimed to be a civil engineer needed to burn so many papers in their fireplace in the middle of a scorching Maryland summer. This is the true story of how a curious neighbor, armed with binoculars, a notebook, and an irritating determination to discover the truth, changed the course of the Cold War. And it all started with a simple question: why the hell would anyone light a fireplace in August? Before we dive deep into the story, subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're from. Arthur Pemberton had retired from the United States Treasury Department in June 1957, after 40 years examining financial records with the meticulousness of a surgeon and the patience of a Buddhist monk. His wife, Dorothy, had died 2 years earlier from a brain aneurysm that took her while she was arranging flowers in the garden, a moment so quick that she didn't even drop the pruning shears she was still holding when Arthur found her. Since then, Arthur lived alone in the red brick house at 246 Elm Ridge Road, a quiet, tree-lined street in Bethesda where everyone knew everyone, and the biggest excitements were Saturday garage sales and the ice cream truck that passed by on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4 in the afternoon, playing a distorted version of Turkey in the Straw that made the neighborhood dogs howl in protest. Arthur's house smelled of mothballs and old coffee. The lace curtains Dorothy had chosen still hung in the windows, yellowed by time and sunlight. On the dining room table, where family albums and dried flower arrangements once sat, now lay stacks of spiral notebooks, Bausch and Lomb binoculars he'd bought at a military surplus equipment store, and a small transistor radio always tuned to the local news station. Arthur wasn't a naturally sociable man, never had been. Even during the marriage years, Dorothy was the one who chatted with neighbors, who organized dinners, who remembered the children's birthdays on the street. Without her, Arthur retreated into his natural shell, a human snail who observed the world through dusty windows and wrote down everything he saw in meticulously organized columns. He had notebooks for different aspects of the neighborhood. One recorded schedules. When the mailman arrived, always between 10:15 and 10:45, except on Mondays when he was about 20 minutes late. When children left for school, 7:30 for the high school bus, 8:15 for elementary school. When Mr. Chen from number 239 went out for his morning walk, 6:30 punctually, rain or shine, except Sundays. Another notebook cataloged vehicles, makes, models, colors, license plates. Arthur could tell when someone had visitors because he instantly recognized any car that didn't belong to the street. A third notebook, his favorite, contained anomalies, things that didn't fit established patterns. It was in this notebook that the Hoffmans began to occupy more and more pages. Peter and Greta Hoffman had moved to number 247 in March 1958, 5 months before that August morning. Arthur remembered the day exactly because it was a Tuesday, the ice cream truck didn't come because of heavy rain, and because the moving truck that brought their belongings had New York plates, but the driver spoke with a deep Southern accent. First anomaly: Peter Hoffman was an ordinary-looking man in his 40s, brown hair beginning to thin on top, thick-framed glasses, ties always a bit too wide for current fashion. He drove a 1956 ivory-colored Chevrolet Bel Air that was always impeccably clean, as if washed daily. Greta was a few years younger, blonde hair pulled into a conservative bun, floral dresses that looked straight out of a 5-year-old Sears catalog. They claimed to have come from Buffalo, New York, where Peter had worked for an engineering firm that went bankrupt. Now he had a job with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Work that, according to him during a casual conversation with Mr. Chen about lawn mowing, involved infrastructure planning for military installations. Greta, Peter said, was a housewife, a German immigrant he'd met during the post-war occupation when he served in the army in Berlin. Everything sounded perfectly normal, perfectly American, perfectly constructed. Arthur noticed the first real inconsistency one May morning. He was on his porch, pretending to read the Washington Post, but actually observing, over the newspaper, when he saw Peter leaving for work. The man carried a brown leather briefcase, new and stiff, and when he placed it in the back seat of the car, it opened slightly. From inside, Arthur saw the characteristic shine of photographic paper. Not normal office documents on common sulfite paper, but the type of thick, glossy paper used for photographs or technical prints. Civil engineers used blueprints, of course, but that specific type of glossy paper, and in such quantity, Arthur noted in his notebook, May 5th, 7:42 a.m., ph. Carries briefcase with photographic material unusual for routine civil engineering work. The second inconsistency came 2 weeks later. Arthur was in his backyard, pulling weeds, actually strategically positioned where he could see the Hoffmans' backyard through the wooden fence with missing slats, when he heard Greta talking on the phone. Her kitchen window was open because of the May heat, and her voice carried clearly through the still air. She was speaking in German. Arthur didn't speak German, but recognized the sound. He'd worked with several colleagues of German origin at Treasury. But something was wrong. The cadences didn't sound right. And then she switched to English mid-sentence, and Arthur clearly heard. Confirmed for Thursday. The material will be ready. Material? What material? Arthur noted, May 19th, 2:33 p.m., GH phone conversation in questionable German, mentions material for Thursday. The anomalies accumulated. The Hoffmans rarely received mail, unusual for people who claimed to have recently moved from another state. When they did receive it, Peter always picked up the mail immediately, as if waiting for it, and never left anything in the mailbox until evening like the rest of the neighborhood did. They never invited neighbors inside. When Mrs. Patterson, from number 251 appeared, with a welcome cake in April, Greta accepted it at the door, but didn't invite her in. Something Mrs. Patterson considered extremely rude during the weekly gossip session at the grocery store. And then there was the strange nighttime behavior. 3 times in June, Arthur saw lights turn on in the Hoffmans' garage after midnight. Not the main garage lights, but a dim light, like from a flashlight or candle. And once, at 2:37 a.m., Arthur had noted the exact time, he saw Peter leave the garage carrying a small box, looking cautiously both ways down the street before placing it in the trunk of the Chevrolet. But it was the August fireplace that crystallized all of Arthur's suspicions into certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with the Hoffmans. Maryland in August is relentless. Humidity hangs in the air like a wet towel. Temperatures easily climb to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Nobody, absolutely nobody, lights fireplaces. Air conditioning systems struggle against the heat. Fans spin uselessly in open windows. The last thing any sensible person would do is generate more heat. Yet on August 23, 1958, at 9:17 in the morning, Arthur saw smoke coming from the chimney at number 247. He was watering his petunias, the perfect pretext to stay on the porch long enough to observe, when he noticed the distorted air above the Hoffmans' chimney. It wasn't much smoke. Whoever was burning things was trying to be discreet. But it was unmistakable. Arthur left the watering can, went inside, and grabbed his binoculars. He positioned himself behind the lace curtain at the front window, focusing on the Hoffmans' house. Through their living room window, he could see Peter feeding papers into the fireplace. Not logs of wood, papers, documents, one at a time, watching each burn completely before adding the next. Arthur's heart raced. 40 years of auditor instinct screamed that this was wrong. Deeply wrong. People burned documents for only a few reasons: financial fraud, destruction of evidence, or espionage. The word formed in his mind like an accusation. Espionage. It was 1958. The Cold War was in full swing. Senator McCarthy had turned witch hunting for communists into a national sport just a few years earlier. Stories of Soviet espionage networks appeared in newspapers with enough regularity to make the public suspicious of anyone with an accent or unusual behavior, but accuse someone of espionage based on what? Photographic paper? Strange accented German? Burning papers? Arthur could imagine how it would sound if he went to the police. "Officer, my neighbors are burning documents on a hot morning." The response would be laughter and suggestions that he get a hobby. No, he needed more. He needed real evidence. And Arthur Pemberton, after 40 years tracking financial discrepancies through mountains of paperwork, knew exactly how to build a case based on evidence. That night, Arthur began what he would call Operation Neighbor in his notebook. He created a more systematic surveillance system. He would note every movement, every visitor, every deviation from normal pattern. And then, when he had enough evidence, he would take everything to the appropriate authorities. What Arthur didn't know was that his Operation Neighbor was about to intersect with a real FBI investigation that had been discreetly monitoring Peter Hoffman for 3 months, waiting for the right moment to act. And the key to breaking the entire case would come not from professional investigators, but from the meticulously recorded observations of a bored retiree who simply paid too much attention. Over the next 6 weeks, Arthur Pemberton transformed into something between Sherlock Holmes and an obsessive suburban voyeur. His daily routine revolved completely around monitoring the Hoffmans. He woke at 6 a.m., half an hour before Peter left for work, and positioned himself at the second-floor bedroom window with his binoculars and notebook. He noted the exact time Peter left. It varied between 7:15 and 7:35. Inconsistency number 47, people with normal office jobs typically kept more regular hours. What he carried: always the brown leather briefcase, occasionally a second, smaller bag, and any unusual behavior patterns. Arthur noticed that every Tuesday and Thursday, Peter put something in the trunk before leaving. Something wrapped in brown paper, approximately the size of a file folder. And on Tuesdays and Thursdays, he always returned home exactly 47 minutes later than on other days. Where was he going? What was he delivering? Greta had her own suspicious patterns. Every Wednesday at 2 p.m., she left on foot, carrying a floral fabric shopping bag, and walked 8 blocks to the public library. Arthur followed her once, maintaining respectful distance, hidden behind his newspaper, and observed that she never checked out books. Instead, she went directly to the periodicals section, sat at a specific table near the back, and read magazines for exactly 1 hour before leaving. But on one Wednesday, September 10th, Arthur saw something that made his pulse race. Greta was sitting at her usual table when a man in a gray suit sat 2 tables ahead. He opened a newspaper, read for a few minutes, and then got up to go to the bathroom, leaving the newspaper on the table. Greta waited exactly 2 minutes. Arthur timed it, then stood up, passed by the man's table as if going to the book section, and in a movement so subtle Arthur almost missed it even while watching directly, switched her newspaper for his. She returned to her table, casually leafed through the new newspaper for a few minutes, removed something from inside. Arthur couldn't see what. It was small, perhaps an envelope or folded paper, placed it in her bag, and left. The man in the suit returned 5 minutes later, picked up the newspaper Greta had left, her original one, folded it carefully, and exited in the opposite direction. Arthur almost dropped his disguise from pure shock. That was a classic, clandestine exchange. He'd read about them in espionage articles in the Saturday Evening Post. Brush pass, or dead drop. Techniques used by spies to exchange information without being seen talking directly. He wrote down everything, every detail. Description of the man, approximate height, 5'11", dark hair with gray at the temples, European cut gray suit, well-polished black shoes, no wedding ring. Exact time of the exchange, 2:37 p.m., precise location in the library. But it still wasn't enough. It wasn't concrete proof. Any decent lawyer could argue coincidence, confused newspapers, anything. Arthur needed something undeniable. The opportunity came on September 24th, a Tuesday. Arthur had noticed that Tuesdays were trash days on Elm Ridge Road. Metal trash cans were placed on sidewalks Monday evening, and the garbage truck passed at 6:30 Tuesday morning when most people were still sleeping. Arthur, who had woken at 5:30 religiously since retiring, decided to take a look at the Hoffmans' trash before it was collected. It wasn't technically illegal. Once trash was on the public sidewalk, it was no longer private property. At least, that's what Arthur told himself, to justify what he was about to do. At 5:45 a.m., wearing a dark robe and slippers, Arthur silently left his house, crossed the empty street, and opened the lid of the Hoffmans' trash can. The smell of food scraps and moldy paper hit him, but he ignored the disgust, focusing on the task. Inside were the normal remains of a family: potato peels, food packaging, used coffee filters. But underneath, wrapped in newspaper, Arthur found something interesting. Fragments of burned paper. Not completely burned. Some pieces had survived, probably fallen beside the fireplace instead of inside it. Arthur took the larger pieces, carefully placed them in a plastic bag he'd brought, always prepared, always meticulous, and returned home before anyone saw him. At his dining room table, under the strong light of his reading lamp, Arthur examined the fragments. Most were too damaged to read, but some larger pieces preserved partial text, and what he saw made his blood run cold. One fragment showed what appeared to be part of a technical diagram. Lines, numbers, symbols Arthur vaguely recognized from engineering documents he'd seen during government audits. Another fragment had typewritten text in English. Classified: missile installation, coordinates 38.7 degrees N, 77.1 degrees W. Arthur grabbed an atlas and checked the coordinates. They pointed to somewhere in the Washington, D.C. area, exactly where many sensitive military and government facilities were located. Peter Hoffman, the supposed civil engineer working on infrastructure planning, was burning documents marked classified about missile installations. Arthur sat in silence for long minutes. The paper fragments spread before him like pieces of a sinister puzzle. He had searched for anomalies, for inconsistencies, for proof that something was wrong, and now that he had it, the weight of responsibility hit him like a freight train. If he was right, if the Hoffmans really were Soviet spies, then every day of delay in reporting them meant more secrets transmitted, more damage to national security. But what if he was wrong? What if there was some perfectly innocent explanation that his paranoid retiree mind couldn't conceive? Arthur spent the rest of the day photographing the fragments with his Kodak camera, using black and white film and careful lighting to capture every legible detail. He organized his 6 weeks of observation notes in chronological order, creating a timeline, and then, with slightly trembling hands, part fear, part excitement, part pure determination, he picked up the phone and called the FBI. The operator transferred his call 3 times before finally connecting him with someone who identified himself as Special Agent James Markham. Arthur explained who he was, where he lived, and that he had information about possible espionage activity in his neighborhood. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Mr. Pemberton, can you describe exactly what you observed?" Arthur described everything: the strange patterns, the exchanges at the library, the burned documents, the fragments he recovered. He expected skepticism, perhaps even mockery. Instead, he heard the sound of typewriter keys, precise questions, growing interest in Markham's voice. "Mr. Pemberton, do you still have those document fragments?" "Yes, I photographed all of them too." "Perfect. Don't touch anything else. Don't approach your neighbors anymore. Don't do anything different from your normal routine. Someone will visit you tomorrow to collect the materials and your notes. Agent Markham. Am I right? Are they?" Another long silence. Then, carefully, "Mr. Pemberton, I can't confirm or deny ongoing investigations, but I can say that the information you provided is extremely valuable. You did the right thing by contacting us." Ongoing investigations. So the FBI was already watching the Hoffmans. Arthur wasn't a crazy old man seeing spies in every shadow. He had, accidentally, stumbled upon something real. The next morning, a discreet gray Plymouth car parked in front of Arthur's house. Two men in suits, Agent Markham and his partner, Agent Davis, rang the doorbell at 9 a.m. sharp. Inside Arthur's living room, surrounded by the smell of mothballs and old coffee, the agents meticulously examined the document fragments, the photographs, and the 6 notebooks of annotations Arthur had accumulated. Markham, a serious man in his early 40s, with dark hair combed back and eyes that missed nothing, flipped through the notebooks with something close to admiration. "Mr. Pemberton, these notes are extraordinarily detailed. Do you have training in investigation?" "Treasury auditor. 40 years. Retired." Markham nodded, as if that explained everything. "That makes sense. You document anomalies the same way we would document evidence. So, was I right? Are they spies?" Markham and Davis exchanged glances. Finally, Markham spoke. "Mr. Pemberton, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room. Do you understand?" Arthur nodded, heart racing. Peter Hoffman is not his real name. It's Pyotr Volkov, Soviet intelligence officer operating under deep cover. He was infiltrated into the United States in 1953, spent 2 years building a false identity in Buffalo, and then got a job with the Army Corps of Engineers in 1956. We've been monitoring him for 3 months, since a Soviet defector provided us with his code name. And Greta? Support agent. His real wife is in the Soviet Union. Greta, or rather Galina, is his local controller, facilitating communications with Moscow. Arthur sat heavily. And the man at the library? That's a fish we haven't identified yet. Your observations and description will give us our first lead on his identity. Markham paused. "Mr. Pemberton, you accidentally provided us with the missing piece. We had Volkov under surveillance but couldn't definitively prove he was transmitting classified information. These document fragments you recovered? They match materials that disappeared from a secure safe 3 weeks ago. He photocopied them, passed them to Galina, and she transmitted them to the library contact. Will you arrest them? We're already in position. This afternoon, when Volkov returns from work, we'll execute simultaneous warrants here, at his office, and at the contact's residence once we identify him using your description." And that's exactly what happened. At 5:32 p.m. that afternoon, Arthur watched from the safety of his window as 4 black cars surrounded number 247. FBI agents, identified by vests with large letters on the back, emerged with weapons drawn. Peter Hoffman, Pyotr Volkov, was getting out of his Chevrolet when he was approached. He didn't resist, just stood still, hands slowly rising, expression transforming from shock to resignation. Greta came out of the house, also with her hands up. Neighbors emerged from their houses, attracted by the commotion. Mrs. Patterson stood agape. Mr. Chen simply shook his head in disbelief, and Arthur Pemberton watched it all from his window, feeling a strange mixture of validation, relief, and sadness at having been right. The operation recovered years of photographed, classified documents, radio transmission equipment hidden in the Hoffman's attic, and microfilms containing detailed plans of American military installations. The library contact, identified using Arthur's description, was a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy with diplomatic immunity. He was declared persona non grata and expelled from the country within 72 hours. Volkov and Galina were tried, convicted, and sentenced to 25 years each in federal prison. The trial revealed they had transmitted information about 37 different military installations, including missile silo locations and specifications for new radar systems. Arthur was called to testify at the trial, but only about how he found the document fragments. His complete role in the investigation remained classified to protect intelligence methods. He received a personal letter from J. Edgar Hoover thanking him for his exceptional assistance in a matter of national security, which he framed and hung on his office wall next to his Treasury retirement certification. The neighbors on Elm Ridge Road talked about the arrest for months. Conspiracy theories flourished. Some claimed they'd always known something was wrong with the Hoffmans. Others insisted it was all a misunderstanding, that the government was getting paranoid. Arthur never told anyone about his real role. When asked, He simply shrugged and said he'd noticed some strange cars and called the police. He let people draw their own conclusions. He lived another 14 years, dying in 1972 at 77 from pneumonia. His obituary in the Washington Post described him as retired auditor and war veteran, survived by a niece and 2 great-nephews. It mentioned nothing about espionage. Arthur's notebooks, his meticulous notes and observations, were donated to the National Archives by his niece in 1998. They were declassified in 2008 and are now studied by intelligence historians as a perfect example of how citizen vigilance can complement professional investigations. One researcher wrote, Arthur Pemberton demonstrated that national security is not the exclusive responsibility of intelligence agencies. Attentive citizens, armed with nothing more than curiosity and determination, can make significant contributions to protecting their country. Number 247 Elm Ridge Road sat empty for 2 years before being sold to a young family with 3 noisy children who definitely weren't spies, just exhausted parents trying to survive the years of diapers and sleepless nights. Arthur probably would have approved. Noisy, chaotic, but perfectly normal. And sometimes, normalcy is exactly what a neighborhood needs. Arthur Pemberton's story teaches something fundamental about the nature of the Cold War and civil vigilance. The great ideological conflicts of the era weren't fought only at summit conferences in Geneva or proxy battlefields in Korea. They were fought on suburban streets where the line between justified paranoia and legitimate observation was dangerously thin. Arthur could easily have become a caricature, the nosy neighbor, the lonely old man seeing threats in every shadow. But he wasn't paranoid. He was meticulous. He didn't assume guilt based on suspicions. He collected evidence, and when he finally acted, he did so through appropriate channels, not through public accusations or vigilantism. That distinction matters. In an era of fear and suspicion, where the witch hunts of McCarthyism had ruined lives based on unfounded accusations, Arthur represented something different. Responsible, vigilant citizenship. He observed, documented, verified, and then reported to appropriate authorities. He let professionals do their job. And in the process, a retiree with too much free time and a tendency to pay too much attention to his neighbors accidentally became part of one of the most successful counterintelligence stories of the Cold War era. Because, in the end, a nation's security doesn't depend only on secret agents and sophisticated technology. Sometimes, it depends on ordinary people who simply care enough to pay attention and are brave enough to speak up when something isn't right, even if it means rummaging through neighbors' trash at 5:45 on a Tuesday morning. And so ends our story. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. If you didn't enjoy it, leave a dislike. It's very important for us to know the truth. Be honest in the comments, leaving creative suggestions so we can improve more and more the quality of our content. Comment where you're from, check out the stories and video on screen. I'm sure you'll like it. See you in a few seconds. My name is Victor Hale, and this is my contribution.